freedom is something that philosophers have spoken about, because beyond the issue of the politics of the day, there is our own individual, personal freedom. Freedom seems to be something we individually desire and seek. And especially, of course, in the post-Enlightenment era, where we have developed the notion that we are all equal individuals seeking some kind of freedom as a right. And so it leads the philosophers to beg the question, what is freedom? If you think about it, and as South Africans we also know this, freedom is potentially quite a radical thing. It often requires the most radical of actions in order to achieve the particular kind of freedom that we mean. So today we're going to be talking about a philosopher who took a rather radical approach to the subject of freedom, and he is of course J Krishnamurthi, who many of you will know of and will know his famous work, Total Freedom. Let's see what his solution to this endless quest is all about. If you're a regular viewer of this show, you know that the philosophy of the Stoics is something that I have an interest in and interest in talking about. And before I get into Krishnamurti, it's worth just mentioning what the great Stoic philosopher Epictetus said about freedom. Of course, the interesting thing about him is that in his earlier life he was a slave and later was freed by his master. So he, of course, would know better than anyone else what freedom is really all about and what the quest for freedom is all about. But not surprisingly, in the end, it boils down to even part of how and why he develops the Stoic philosophy further, the Stoic philosophy which had been inherited from, even then, somewhat ancient Greece. So it ultimately boils down to the basic ideas that the reason that we're not free is because we endlessly rely on other people and our lives are endlessly hooked into the lives of other people. Basically, we are interconnected into other people who essentially even might be our masters. Epictetus, of course, says whenever we have masters, we cannot be free. And those masters are not only human and not only divine, they may also be circumstances. We have countless circumstances, he says, that keep us from being free. And he gives many examples of how various situations look like freedom, even a slave being freed. But then he gets to the nitty-gritty of the reliance on other people or the honoring or worshipping of other people as masters, and ultimately boils it down to freedom comes from self-reliance, from never desiring what is not in our power to have, and never desiring what is not actually ours, which is quite a point. He says not even your health is within your power to have. You can't control that. Release yourself from the desires of things that you're not in control of and don't have, and you will be free. Easily said, not easily done, but probably quite true. Krishnamurti essentially takes many of the same ideas a whole lot further. Krishnamurti's early life experience might look very different to that of the slave Epictetus, but in some important ways it's very much the same. And perhaps in the same way that Epictetus's journey out of slavery helped him understand a philosophy of freedom, so indeed did Krishnamurti's journey out of a very different kind of slavery, leading to the same thing. Krishnamurti was an Indian philosopher who was discovered on a bench basically at the age of 14 by an English theosophist by the name of Charles Leadbeater, who went as a psychic philosopher, travelled in India at the time as people were doing, basically identified the young Krishnamurti, who was by all accounts a somewhat dim-witted boy who was pretty much a poor student and didn't have much going for him, decided that he was the future world leader, that he had a pure aura and he would be the future spiritual leader. And he was eventually pretty much adopted by the Theosophical, the masters of the Theosophical organization, and by the age of 18 was already filling the model of this forthcoming world teacher that the Theosophists were claiming, and in 1911 created the Order of the Star with him as the leader, and he was to be the world leader. Well, fortunately for us all, Krishnamurti was not nearly as dim-witted as he appeared to be, and from his own experience of being under the control and influence of all these people, he began to understand the fundamental issues of freedom, and that ultimately he was not free, and that anyone who was seeking wisdom or enlightenment or guidance through him or the Order of the Star was not free, because they were looking to another master, himself. So at a meeting, the great meeting of the Order of the Star in 1929, he stood up to deliver the opening address, and his opening address was the business of dissolving the Order of the Star, justifying it by explaining that people are trapped in their seeking for masters and their seeking for knowledge and so on. They can never be free as long as they are seeking outside of himself. And he devoted much of his work on and off through the years, and especially at that time, in elucidating the concept of freedom, eventually in a work called Total Freedom. Much of what I say today about Krishnamurti's work comes from his early writings on freedom, which were developed and refined somewhat, but still represent some of the core of his thoughts on that. So some of you might have to hang on to your hats for a little bit of what Krishnamurti says, but keep an open mind and see if you are able to identify with what he says. Ultimately, he says, in order to overcome suffering, I mean, we all seek wisdom and we all seek spiritual paths, essentially to overcome the difficulty of the world. And he says, in order to overcome suffering and conflict and to achieve fulfillment, we need clear thinking and intelligent action. So, in many ways, we don't need information, we need thinking. He says that before we can achieve any kind of fulfillment, we must be able to free ourselves from the background of the environment in the shape of traditions and habits and prejudices. He says it is those things that cause us to not understand life correctly. And so we become confused and we suffer, because we've got fixed ideas of how we should behave and what's right and wrong. And those fixed ideas are transmitted to us from our environment, which includes our upbringing. This is why we live life incorrectly, because it's based on some pre-existing idea rather than living life itself. And we all worry about the problems of the world and the chaos and the confusion in the world. So who guides us in that? He says, well, we follow experts. And experts come along and they say, this is what the problem of the world is, and this is how it should be solved. But some other expert comes along and says, no, 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 this is the problem of the world, and that's in fact how it should be resolved. So experts develop bodies of knowledge and parties and followers, and he says basically, how can they both be right? Surely neither of them must be right, because truth and falsity are never in conflict. Truth stands as truth. But falsity and falsity can easily be in conflict, because one says I'm right, another says no, I'm right. Another says no, I've got all my followers. Another says I've got a PhD. And on it goes, and just more confusion and chaos results. The individual, he says, becomes merely a tool in the hands of the group or of the expert. And this idea of the individual in that slavery, essentially, drives a lot of his work on freedom. You can hear him describing somewhat himself, that he has the experience of being guided by experts who claim philosophical truths that are different than other existing philosophical truths, which leads him to understand that the only thing that could be true is that neither of them are right. An interesting thought, but he didn't stop there. His concern is that we are subject to the forces of government and politics and others who would dominate us. To the extent that he says, to a large extent, the purpose of governments is to dominate us. They draw their power from us, things that we still recognize as major philosophical arguments of our own day. So he says, okay, so what is the solution to that? Is it mass action? Should we all rise up and say, I will not stand for this? Should we rise up against our governments and our leaders who seek to dominate us, remove our power, and therefore our freedom? Well, he says, mass action can only make sense when the individuals who are part of it are individually awake and take full responsibility for their actions without compulsion. And that's also something easier said than done. Because we think, yeah, when we hear that, I know what I believe. But in a mass action situation, we're often swept along by the crowd. We're emboldened by the crowd. I've got this force around me that means I can scream something that I would never normally say, and there'll be no consequences. Or I might do something I might never normally do, such as smash a window, and there'll be no consequences. We feel empowered. We feel made safe by the crowd. But Krishnamurti says you're not free. You are being compelled by the crowd force. You are not awake. The individual must awaken. You alone are responsible for fulfilling yourself. And there is no situation where a crowd or a group or something like that would fulfill you. So then, in order for you to be responsible for your own fulfillment, there must be a revolution in your thinking. You must willingly and voluntarily undergo a revolution in yourself and a revolution in your thinking. And for that to happen, you also need to break out of things like class or race or whatever the case may be. You need to see that all those definitions deny you your freedom. Because he says, if there are different classes and different races and everyone's different or has some different level of responsibility or freedom, then there is no freedom because we're being controlled by a group thought and environment. He says the world must be a single human unit, and that is achieved by demolishing class, race, and other categories. Getting further into the idea, Krishnamurti points out that we are all seeking security and certainty. We experience so much fear of what we don't know, fear of political situations and other people and economic situations and what the neighbors or the enemies might do or what fate itself might visit upon us. And essentially, we look for security in response to all of that. We look for certainty, and the certainty and security we look for is of our own ego, our own thoughts, our own actions. We get security through possessions and love, he says, is just another form of possessiveness. Nationalism, another search for identity and search for security. The idea that you belong to a particular country, that we're fabulous, that we're good, that we've done these things, that we will beat you, even if it's just at the soccer. Any of these kind of ideas lead to antagonism. They lead to forms of conflict, whether it's in that soccer game or more commonly war or competition. And antagonism then feeds into the idea that, well, there's a political situation. This is what we must do. This is the law of what we must do. This is how we will respond as a country, as a community, as a group, or whatever. All these are forms of nationalism. As soon as we identify with a group or a country, it's a form of nationalism. And that, he says, is the origin of war. All nationalism leads to war. Or to put it a little bit more simply, even if it isn't nationalism in the nation-state sense of word, as soon as we've got the idea of us and our group, and that there's some membership of that group that automatically excludes some other people, citizenship of any country is a good example of that, that will lead to antagonism, and that will lead to the government to take control of the individuals, and ultimately to turn man against man, woman against woman, man against woman. And so it's through the bigger forces percolating down to us that antagonism is expressed as war. And you don't need me to tell you, governments use people as human fodder in order to achieve their power needs and their resource needs through war. Human beings become fodder. So, says Krishnamurti, is nationalism compatible with freedom? Krishnamurti says, what is this ego that is seeking security? It is a composite of our various hopes and dreams, fears, longings, prejudices, likes, views, habits. We glorify those things as our temperament. But he says it's not our temperament, it's the result of our upbringing and our environment. It is our environment. It's the context that has created us and that we create around ourselves. It's our memories that build the sense of who I am. So the ego, I, that which we call I, is constantly looking for immortality. It believes it exists and it wants to exist. So he says the ego seeks immortality for the I. And so what is false, the ego, tries to become real and permanent. And this is, of course, innately impossible and a form of conflict. And then what happens is, in order for that to become possible, we seek people outside of ourselves, gurus, masters, teachers, answers, who will then tell us how to do that, how to make the ego live forever, how to be this I. And so we seek the masters. And he says, you are now expecting someone else to liberate you. You want other people to make you immortal out of a reaction to an environment that has created you and which is in fact a reaction called fear. The environment tells us you're going to die, these are where other people are in control, etc., etc., etc. All the fear that it creates. Fear makes us want to be immortal. Guru comes along and says, here's how to be immortal. And Krishnamurti says, how can you possibly think that? How can you think that someone else can make you immortal when what's making you mortal in the first place is yourself in response to your environment? It is fear. Our sense of mortality is a fear-based response to an environment that is essentially composed out of falsehoods, distortions, agendas that politics and all sorts of other people have, beliefs, and beliefs are a big problem for Krishnamurti, out of all the sociological systems and political methods and economic arguments and etc. All of this creates an environment that creates fear and therefore makes no sense that some outside guru with some philosophy could possibly release us from our fears, because the source of them is always there. Not only the environment, but the sense that the ego is this independent I. And so we automatically, by seeking freedom that way, set ourselves in further conflict with the environment and further conflict with others, and so we become even more lost. Seeking masters causes you to become lost, according to Krishnamurti. He takes it much further. To Krishnamurti, religion is just another search for this egotistic security and immortality. He says religion is created by men, not by divine beings. Through the ages, these beliefs called religion become sanctified and we become enslaved to them. And then through fear, we submit ourselves to them and to the authority of the human beings who embody that religion and who promise us immortality. Human beings tell us we will be immortal and live forever in eternal life or in heaven or wherever it may be if we just do X, Y, and Z. And why? Because for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, our ancestors have said that so often that it now becomes sacred itself. Krishnamurti says that is religion. Through fear, he says, you create spiritual authorities who exploit you through beliefs, through dogma and creed and pomp and pageantry and ritual. Religion is the result of fear, he says. It is not the search for God or truth. Those things are independent of religion. Krishnamurti doesn't necessarily have a problem with God. It's religion that he says is not going to give you an answer because it's man-made, designed to establish authority over other people and therefore deny you your freedom. We have built religion out of the desire for selfish continuance of our own personal existence. Krishnamurti says as long as there is fear, we will create authority in other people and in their ideas. And that leads to us subjugating ourselves to others and becoming exploited by others. The good news, Krishnamurti says there is a way out. Become conscious of these structures. Wake up to it. Become conscious of the source of fear, the source of your own fear, and the source of fear in the world. He says be willing to eradicate it, whatever the consequence might be. That will require courage because it means you will come into conflict with people around you. You will come into conflict with your family because you will come into conflict with their belief system, the one that you were brought up in. You need to be able to confront the beliefs that you were handed and the practices that you were handed by that family, by that world around you. That's why he says it requires courage. By becoming conscious of what imprisons you, you'll see how your thought continuously tries to avoid admitting it and come into conflict with all these values. I mean, think right now, as you're listening to me, as you're listening to Krishnamurti via me, see your mind fighting back. See how there's ifs, ands, and buts. See how you might have come up with how it doesn't apply to, in your case, or doesn't apply to your religion, or doesn't apply to your upbringing or your country or something like that. That is your mind seeking to escape and go back into fear because we are trapped by that need for security and immortality. And if you go back into the givens, you'll be immortal. If you listen to what Krishnamurti says, there's no guarantee. The mind wants to escape into an illusion rather than face the suffering that will follow once it begins to question the values it was given. When you begin to question those values, you will awaken the true creative intelligence that will allow us to solve our human problems. We rely on experts to resolve problems, climate change, religion and war, so many different things. We put all the solutions outside of ourselves. We must wake ourselves up. He says we do not need guidance. We need awakening. Free yourself from the prison. Free yourself from the environment. Free yourself from the givens, the traditions, the religions, the experts, the gurus, the memories. Liberate yourself into total freedom and you can solve your problems and even those of the human condition. Well, as you can imagine, and maybe you experienced it yourself, Krishnamurti is not always easy to take, but he made an impact throughout the 20th century because of his courage and willingness to say things as he saw them. We will certainly be visiting Krishnamurti again in the future. Stay tuned for more, and of course be here next week at the usual time.